Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Joe Baker from York University about his new book, The Tyranny of Talent, how it compels and limits athletic achievement and why you should ignore it. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about my new book, Learning to Optimize Movement: Harnessing the Power of the Athlete-Environment Relationship, available now on Amazon in paperback and ebook formats. This book is the follow-up to my best-selling skill acquisition book, How We Learn to Move. In it, I discuss how we can go beyond learning basic coordination to becoming an elite mover, evidence-based principles for learning and coaching optimal movement. Take your game from proficiency to mastery. Now on to the show. Okay, today my pleasure to be joined again with Joe Baker from York University. It's been on a couple times, I think, a while back. But I wanted to talk to Joe about his new book, The Tyranny of Talent, which I actually just finished over all day, and I really enjoyed. So thanks for joining me, Joy.
Thanks, Rob. It's good to connect again.
Yeah, and so before we get into the actual topic of talent, I wanted to ask you about, in the kind of the preface, the lead up to the book, you talk about the challenge of writing a book like this, which I can sympathize with, the kind of going from the scientific writing where we have to qualify everything, and it's hilarious. We actually point out the flaws of our work before anyone else can, right? In the limitation section, to a book like this where people want you to make conclusions and be a bit more definitive. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And it was a real challenge to do that, because I think, and I talk about this in the book, that a good scientist is always sort of sitting on the fence waiting for evidence that runs contrary to what they believe. And so it's tough to come down and say, coaches do this, because there's a level of conclusiveness that I think we should shy away from as scientists. But the downside of that is, in the vacuum of knowledge where scientists aren't coming down clearly with recommendations, then people fill that void. And I think in terms of talent and athlete development, we've seen that void be filled with people that are, peddling messages that are too simple, that run counter to the evidence. And so, this was a bit of a push for me to get off the fence and actually come down with some more solid recommendations and conclusions. My prediction is I'm not going to, if we go 20 years from now, I'll change my mind about some of those things. And I think, if we could convince readers about that's how science works, don't look at what I did 20 years ago, look at what I'm doing now. And, I think that's how we need to be thinking about science. And so, this was my little contribution to that whole discussion.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Joe. And I think sometimes we need to be a little kind of forceful and make people think. And by coming off stronger than, being kind of confrontational a little bit, I think that it is important, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And that confrontational part is, that's a part that I'm less comfortable with. But as I'm getting older and, I'm more advanced in my career, I see that if you want to get stuff done, you have to provoke. And if you're just kind of sitting in the background, just producing without that provocation, then you're losing some of the impact that your work can have and some of the change that your work could promote. And so, even on social media and things like that, I've found that I'm trying to poke a little bit more than just, hey, here's our paper. Look at, try to cite it when you can, that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I same with me. It's something about getting older and you get grumpy, I think. And also, I remember a conversation I think over a beer I had with Lou Hardy many years ago. Yeah. And he was always a big, especially when you're doing applied work, he always told me, would you bet a mortgage payment on whether this would work or not? Like, forget about all the science. Like, would you actually, commit to it if you had to? And, you need to think like that when you're working in the real world. You can't just publish things and let people find them. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's get into the topic of talent. I know, obviously you've been on the podcast before and you've done tons of research on this topic before. And I'm sure that was part of with me. I think, you feel like you've reached your kind of this high level view that you can help with people that are diving in one way or the other. So can you tell us, what do we mean by talent, and kind of why do we so attach to this idea? I think you do a good job explaining that.
I think the what do we mean by talent is maybe the biggest struggle that we have in terms of linking the science to the practice. And the research that we've done asking coaches exactly that question has been a real eye opener for us, because the variability and inconsistency and how people use that term is a real challenge. And so, from a measurement standpoint, the fact that we don't have a clear definition of what talent is a real problem. So when we talk to coaches and practitioners, we kind of try to get them to not use that word, because the way that they think about it isn't consistent with the way that we use it in research setting and scientific settings. When coaches use it, they think about talent as a single thing instead of an interaction of maybe thousands of variables that are showing up in how an athlete might be demonstrating performance at that point in time. So from a science conceptual standpoint, we talk about it as talent being that thing that relates to inter-individual variation that could have some relevance for future success. So it's in a real vague sort of conceptual way, which I think is defendable. Where we run into problems is saying, well, with an athlete who's U7, U9, U13, here's what talent is. That's a problem, because first, I don't think we know what that is. Second, I think it oversimplifies the interaction between personal variables, environmental variables, task variables, that sort of Newell's triangle. And when you do that, you undermine the complexity of what coaches do. You make the process seem simpler than it is, which I think if we got coaches to understand the complexity of selection and identification, they'd pay more attention to the quality of the job they're doing there. And so that's why we try to move away from them even using that word. You focus on development instead of identification. Focus on learning instead of talent. They're not separate concepts, obviously, but focusing on one kind of undermines the other.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. I think, I think you're very clear. Like, you're not denying that there's something different that makes some athletes just better, right? But it's not a simple thing to identify. It's not only like you talk about, it could be genetic and the interaction between genetics and opportunity, support. Like, there's so many variables. Yeah.
And in like one athlete, basketball, for example, I think one athlete, height could be the thing that demonstrates their talent. For another, persistence in training and just the ability to focus and put in high quality practice for thousands of hours. We know that there's a genetic component to work ethic and personality and these kinds of variables. So, for one athlete, it could look like height and anthropometrics. For another, it could look like behavior. And both of those things could qualify as talent.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I think that's important to know, not denying that it exists. It's just, it's not as simple. It's a complex interaction of many things. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the reason we're comfortable with that is when you look at the accuracy of our forecasting predictions, they're so poor. Even if we wait until relatively late in the process, which we could explain by coaches are just bad at selecting. Okay, that's part of the argument. I think the more justifiable element is the thing that we're trying to predict is so complicated and sophisticated. It's probably not predictable to a very large extent because of the noise.
Yeah. Yeah. I have my talent thing, an observation. So sometimes I watch Real Housewives with my wife. Don't judge me. And we're watching Real Housewives Real Housewives of New York. And one of the wives of one of the husbands was Tiki Barber, the former New York Giants. Yep. And throughout the show, all the husbands did all these activities. They did softball, playing on a trampoline, riding a bull. And the difference between him and all the other men who were athletic and did high school sports was just, it was so dramatic. But the point, so it's not that everyone would call him, they would say that he's more athletic or has better athleticism or whatever. But the point is, you can't just pinpoint why that is on one simple variable, and have predicted it, when he was in his grade school. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are those cases. I'm reading the new biography of Bo Jackson that came out right before Christmas, and it was clear right from the beginning of his childhood that there was something special about this person. The absence of practice, the performance he was able to demonstrate. Like, it was just, I think there are those people, and those people are easy for scouts and selectors to identify. It's that next level, those almost greats, that noise in the system that makes that task so much more complicated.
Yeah. And I think you make a really good, a point that talent's about predicting, right? And so we get it kind of in the performance versus learning paradox that we have with practice is the same applies to talent, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, what people are doing now does not. I find you actually get two extremes. In baseball, like Moneyball is essentially about how people are ignoring what you're doing now.
Yeah.
And we're trying to look at your tools. Yeah. So I think that's really interesting. And so I know so is there within that kind of talent definition, is there like a capacity to learn kind of component? Like, I know Anders Ericsson's talked a little bit about even he who's one extreme of the right. There's no nature to talent. I know he talked about the kind of there's some people that can commit to deliberate practice better, right? Like these kind of ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We spent a week together in Israel a couple of years ago, and we had great discussions about that because I think when you differentiate people on their ability to learn, you're getting really close, almost razor's edge towards what talent is to most people. And so, if you say people have different capacities to learn, then how are you not saying that that difference is related to talent? And I think this, as a concept that goes way back in motor learning and development to this, the concept of motor educability, the idea that there are people that can just pick up motor tasks or physical tasks easier than other people, which as an idea, I think makes a lot of sense. The problem with it is it's always been really hard to quantify and measure because learning is such a nebulous variable, especially the learning of physical tasks. So I think I like that idea. Again, it comes back to this talent, and a lot of the things that underpinned it make sense conceptually, but it's the measurement element that's the problem. So if we go back to Popper, one of the keys of a good theory is being able to falsify it. I'm not sure some of those concepts would meet that requirement.
Yeah. And I know you also talk in the book, like talent is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's very hard to actually tease apart because talented people get privileges and opportunities that other people don't.
And feedback.
Yeah.
And all that kind of, that cyclical relationship. It's hard to tease out exactly where the talent starts and the environment, where talent stops and the environment starts.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's still, I think you kind of expressed this frustration in the book. Are we really still arguing nature versus nurture? Right. Yeah. Have we not accepted it's both? Right. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that, so you and you give a few good examples of that, the relative age effect and things that, so that how have we, there are kind of interventions to try to kind of prevent this, this self-fulfilling prophecy, teasing people out. How have those kind of, have they been successful at all, would you say, or things like tackling the relative age effect and things like that?
It's tough to determine that for sure because the designs that we've used haven't had a lot of scientific rigor behind them in terms of this. We're going to split the group and this one's going to get an intervention, this one's not, and so we can see the size and scope of the effect. We very rarely get that. I would say for the relative age effect, the closest we get is maybe some of the work that Steve Cobley's doing in Sydney around coming up with algorithms that can adjust for the relative age effect, so that when you see a performance time, and you can only do this in those sort of CGS sports, the centimeters, grams, seconds, where you can actually adjust based on what the effect would have done. But you need a lot of data to be able to do that. It's only in really simple tasks. I think there's a bit of pushback from relative age researchers that we might actually be oversimplifying the psychology that's going on there. Think if you're a swimmer and you're still finishing at the back of the pack, but you're the relatively youngest, and so your coach says, no, actually you're better than everyone else when we adjust your time. I'm not sure that's enough to get over some of the psychological hurdles of still not finishing at the front. So I think it's a bit more complicated than just, let's come up with a simple adjustment that we can do to everybody's performance. But I think that's the first step is, okay, now we've tried this. What are the consequences? What are the implications? Well, let's adjust it. Let's try something else. For 20 years, I think we did nothing about the relative age effect. So that's clearly not the issue, or not the solution either.
Yeah, for sure. And you call, the title of your book, The Tyranny of Talent. Kind of what did you, again, being provocative in competition, I think that's a great word. What do you kind of mean by that?
It's the way that we think about athlete development and this sort of race to identify the people that have the greatest potential for success, and that's everywhere in sport. And when we think about talent in that way, Ross Tucker, the sports scientist from South Africa, he says we end up in a race to the bottom. The earliest we can identify it and stream people into a pathway. If you believe in talent and it's easy to identify, and what it is, and maybe no one else does, then you can justify those kinds of approaches. Our earliest work was on the psychological implications of those kinds of pathways, early specialization, that kind of stuff. And so we know that there are consequences for the athlete, for the system. And so we try to avoid those things when we can. When you think about talent in that way, it is kind of a tyrannical approach because it pervades the entire sports system that we have. If we focused on athletes as not as commodities to be identified and selected and streamed, but as organisms that are evolving over developmental time, that need to be nurtured, that need to be considered as learning organisms, as opposed to fixed things that need to be put in just cogs in a system. I think we'd have a more holistic approach to athlete development, so we'd mitigate some of these negative consequences. We'd also have an environment that was created that more people would be able to thrive in. And so, selfishly, my focus is on how do we get better at producing elite athletes, but is there a way that we can do that that doesn't compromise every other athlete in the system? They grow up hating sport because they got cut from their team when they were 11. I think we can do a better job than we're doing right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I know we've, talked about a lot, the kind of the elite sport model that, how it turns a lot of kids off sport very early, turns them off kind of any movement. And, it could probably easily link it to health problems later on, lack of activity. I think also you raise an interesting point in the book about whether this kind of focus is actually good for us, because it in some ways it rewards traits that we might not want to. Can you talk a little bit about that? I thought that was a really interesting angle.
Yeah, and it's so this comes out of the really interesting and cool study that they did with UK sport, where they looked at it was called the Great British Medalist Study, and they found that athletes that were more likely to have the highest levels of success, multiple medals, multiple world championships, were higher in psychological traits of selfishness and ruthlessness. And the point I make in the book is, do we want to have a society where those traits are rewarded? Because in other areas of society, we actually create systems and approaches to, interaction where we try to prevent those things from showing up. So I think, this was more around generating a more wholesome discussion of what's the purpose of elite sport, and is it to create, to use a throwaway word, is it to create psychopaths who dominate sport but have no other relevance in areas of society? So I think I don't have an answer to that, but I think we need to be thinking about that question because certain sports, and we see this in in Canada, the UK, in the US, with this focus on safe sport, with the focus on reducing athlete abuse and increasing athlete mental health. These are the logical questions that we need to be thinking of. What do we actually want out of our sport? And if the answer is health, well-being, greater proportions of people involved in sport, we actually might create a system that undermines some of these psychological qualities that are related to medal count. For me, I think we shouldn't be afraid of asking those questions because, there's rich things on the other side of that discussion.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. I think especially the younger ages, focusing on different goals for sport than creating Olympic medalists. Like that will, like I think you make a click. We're not good at that. This is not working, right? This focus on earlier and the race to the bottom is not winning, right? So focusing on some more broader things like health and mental health and physical health, and we could still sort out the elite part later on, right? It's going to sort itself out probably. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and the elite high performance, even the highly competitive elements of sport is going to be a perfect fit for a certain type of individual that's wired for that need. But we don't want to create a sports system where that's the only person that can thrive in that environment. And I think we're moving towards a system that is so focused on competition without recognizing that there are other elements that we can get out of people's engagement there. And not only will they get more out of the sport, but the people that end up at the elite level will get more out of their development by having that greater diversity and variability in the system.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you also do a really good job of, talking about all this sounds wonderful, but there's a cost benefit analysis too. It'd be wonderful to have leagues of all different abilities and levels, but that's expensive, right? And so we kind of, it's hard to, so I think, so they're, trying to set this up is going to be a challenge. Yeah.
It is. And, when on my first sabbatical, we lived in Germany, and it's amazing the levels of professional leagues that they have in Germany. Like they'll have 4 or 5 different levels of professional volleyball and netball and handball and all these sorts of, and I have no idea how they're able to pull it off. But if we could think about how that could relate to the way we think about sport in North America, there could be lessons that we could learn there.
Yeah. I've found that interesting too. I think one of the fundamental things I've seen is a country, maybe with the exception of hockey in Canada, we're both Canadian. Most like other European countries, Australia, the national pride they get from sport. It's like compared to the U.S. in particular. If you ask, any young athlete, where would you rather play, for your country or the NBA or the your country would be very low. Ideally both, but it's not what your goal. So it's not playing professionally is the focus rather than representing your country, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, part of that is maybe the construction of the social structure in North America and versus Europe. This sort of, and I heard the argument made when we went through the pandemic that one of the problems with getting people to vaccinate in North America was because we have this sort of loose structure where people feel comfortable pushing back against the government because they, individual liberty is so important. Whereas in Europe, it's a tighter structure. And so national identity is more important. Yeah. We may be seeing something similar in the way that we think about sport. Sport's for me to succeed, not for my country to succeed.
Yeah. And I think we see that in government funding too, right? Funding sports science, you can't do sport. You can't do a research study just to make an athlete better and get funded by the government. For the most part, there's exceptions, they're special, but whereas other countries, like Australia, there's lots of money available for that kind of thing. But I think it's just kind of different. But it is interesting how we have kind of these different models. But If we have these limitations, one of the, questions I get a lot, and I think this touches on this a little bit, is working with athletes in groups. If we can't have the resources to have all these different levels, we're going to have to work, provide opportunities for the really talented guys and everywhere along. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, I think you get into that a little bit in the book too, how we can kind of balance training to be good for everyone.
Yeah, and it's I think in the book it's I present it in a real simple way, but hopefully the reader appreciates how complicated that would actually be. And I think part of that is clarifying what our goals are across the athlete development pathway. And early in development, our goals shouldn't be the same as they are later in development. That specificity of skill, we don't necessarily need that to the extent to which we might want to develop broad-based fundamental movement ability, love of competition and participation, perseverance, maybe early shifts towards intrinsic motivation and those kinds of things that we know are necessary for the long-term engagement that we need to see those really specific skills manifest later on. And if we did that, we'd create environments where we were ticking those kinds of boxes. And those are not specialized environments. Those are general environments where you could have a number of different types of movers, different skill levels interacting with each other. And so it requires a different level of creativity, I think, on the coach or the person designing that environment. But if we clarified what our developmental goals were, we'd probably reconstruct those environments anyway. What happens is we don't really understand what's important during those early phases. And so we just create the thing that we're most comfortable creating, which I know you've talked about on the podcast a lot, which is explicit instruction, blocked practice. Let's get out the cones and set them up. Like that's the easiest thing for coaches to do, keeps kids moving. But whether that relates to the long-term goal of their engagement, I think is probably not.
Yeah. And I think this is where, as kids, we're good at this, right? We're good at coming out with constraints and rules to balance skill levels. And like when we played road hockey as kids, if one guy was way too good, then you just wouldn't invite them back. You wouldn't play with them again. So they would be willing to come up, okay, I'll shoot with the wrong hand stick, or, I'll play defense only, or what, you come up with these different. Kids are very good at it. We seem to lose it when we get on the practice field. Yeah, I
think and it's interesting. I did sort of a world tour at the end of the year last year, and it was interesting that all of the different coaching groups that I talked to, one of the problems that they were struggling with is this idea that parents want coaches to be incredibly involved in their child's sport practice, even during early development. So this idea that coaches could just show up and say, hey, kids, create the game that we want, make sure it's even, make sure it's fair, make sure everybody's moving all the time. They say that's great in principle, but parents would never let that happen because they want the coach to be the person always active and involved, or else they feel like they're not getting their money's worth.
Yeah, no, I've actually experienced this directly in doing a little bit of kind of tennis coaching. People, aren't you supposed to be coaching though? Kind of attitude. Why aren't they? It's so disordered. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and I think that there's kind of this dangerous other end of talent that coaches, the talented at one end, then you have the uncoachable kids at the other end, which I think is a really dangerous kind of thing this is self-fulfilling thing again, I think.
Yeah. And I agree. And, that's later in the book, I get away from, or I try to promote this moving away from a one size fits all strategy. And I think, if our goal was to create a holistic environment where everyone in our care thrives, then those people that were non-responders, I think there are non-responders, and from a physiological standpoint, it looks like that there actually is a group of people that don't respond very well. But that doesn't mean that they don't respond in every single way that you could improve the way that they think about sport. So maybe we're not seeing improvement in skill or physiological outcomes, but are we seeing it in competence feedback? Are we seeing it in enjoyment? Are we seeing it in interest? Well, those things are just as, if not more important than the actual improvements in skill.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point you make as well. These, things like, Gabby Wolf talks about expectancy,
Yeah.
confidence, autonomy, all these things, that are developing too, and have such a powerful effect on actual movement coordination, which we tend to focus way more on. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think, the link between this sort of early high performance athlete development stuff and our other program of research on masters athletes is that sometimes people will leave sport for 2, 3, 4 decades, but they'll come back to it in their 50s and 60s or whatever. And so how do we make sure we don't mess up that re-engagement with the system? I think those questions are really complicated and interesting.
Yeah, I think so. I think, we get this. It's almost, it's an analogy in a way to math, right? You can make people kind of have this aversion to it very early on. That stick is very pervasive. Like I know with kids I've worked with, family members and things that just, I can't do math. It's just they shut off completely. And I think you get the same thing with physical activity. I think I'm not sporty. We learn that very early on. And we don't give a chance to become sporty at all. I think that's interesting. So would you, for coaches, advice? So it's, I think we recognize there's there's talent, there's differences between the athletes we see on the field. Or just, have to be accepted that, we can't pick them out as well as we think. Like the ones that are going to be down the road, right? They're going to be the stars or make it to the professionals, or and also I think the point you make great with the table in your book, even if they were really good, most of them aren't going to make it anyway, right? The odds of making it to the highest level. So we're really have a system designed for focusing on a very, very small percentage of the people there.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we're trying to quantify at the moment, and it's all about whether we can get access to the data or not, is and it's sprung directly from that table, which is early in the book. And the most challenging number is that one that we see in the NBA, which is your odds of a pre-high school kid making it to the NBA is 1 in 70,000. And we have a system that focuses on the creation of that one without appreciating how important the other 69,999 people are. And so I talk a little bit about this in one of the later chapters in the book, that if we could come up with a system where on day one, we could tell who that one person was, we actually couldn't create that person because we need the other 69,000 for them to develop. And so for us, what we're trying to quantify is how many people are necessary to create that one elite ice hockey player or basketball player or whatever. How many people do they need to be able to train against at skill levels that are just about as good as theirs so that they continue to learn in the right ways? How many administrators, how many refs, how many people selling cookies and chocolates and just to support the system? Because otherwise we have a system that overvalues that one person and undervalues everyone else. And we can see the signs of this in some sports like ice hockey, soccer, where we don't struggle to find players, we struggle to find refs because that position is so undervalued that nobody wants to do it. Well, if we don't have that person, the whole system doesn't work. So for us, we're trying to, create this better understanding of talent as an ecosystem and not focusing on that single person who emerges at the end. They don't emerge in isolation. It's not a vacuum. There's hundreds, if not thousands of people that are responsible for the production of that person.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Joe. I would really be interested to see that. But I think you're right. Like, even if we were really ruthless and the goal of sports was of elite athletes, raising the floor of all the other people is a good way to make that person one person better, right? It sounds they're just cannon fodder or something, but in the grand scheme of things, but it's going to help them. It's going to be mutually beneficial, right?
Yeah, if we help them with their transition, maybe they're not going to the Olympics or to the pros, but we can help them have a complete and holistic experience no matter where they end up, so that they continue, that their parents that love sports, their people that buy jerseys and tickets, like the whole system, we require those people at almost every entry and exit point across the whole system. So if we should be doing a better job of helping people transition out whenever that occurs to ensure that it's a positive one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I agree. I'm sure you feel the same. I know you've done a bunch of sports yourself. The benefits of sport beyond becoming an elite athlete, I think, cannot be overstated. I think there's so many good parts to it. There's negatives like anything, but I think there's so many good positives you get out of it if you had no intention of ever being a professional. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's one chapter in the book where I even talk about that, which was kind of a weird one to write because, we do so much work in the high performance space, but it was almost, the question was, why would anybody ever want to be an elite athlete? Like we think about this as glamorous and exciting and, everybody should aspire to it, but it isn't. It's mundane.
I remember, yes.
Hard work. Like, why would you ever want to structure? Why would you want that for your kid?
Yeah.
So I think those questions, we need to be asking them.
Yeah, no, I meant that the mundanity illusion or mundanity. I think I remember that chapter. Yeah, I think, it's right. It's like, I think we both done triathlon at one point in our life. And I think the requirements out like of going to bed early, eating right, like there's so much of life you have to kind of sacrifice, make kind of dull, right? And this kind of ritual that you have to go through to be that high a level. You're right. Does anyone really want that? Yeah.
And maybe that's the benefit of looking back and being at that almost elite level and knowing now how much it would have taken to make that transition to the next level of skill, and being able to say, no, I actually, that I wouldn't have been interested in constructing my life that way, where you couldn't do anything if it wasn't positioned to how is that going to help me train better or compete better.
Yeah.
Some people are wired that way, and I think that's, that we need to recognize that, but most people are not. And so, if we move away from, well, the reason you weren't successful is you didn't train hard enough, which I think could be a really damaging message, to let's try to get as much out of your sport involvement and engagement as you want out of it. I think that's a different kind of message. Yeah.
No, I think it's a good, I think you're really pushing back against the extremes in this book, right? You're both of them. It's all genetic. We can identify you by your physical traits, and also the other extreme, that's all practice, right? It's all you can make anybody great. No coach believes that, right? They see right away, Yeah.
And to be honest, I don't know that Anders believed that either. Yeah. I think it's a good soundbite, but I think when you talk to him about Gretzky and Tiger Woods and Serena Williams and those kinds of people, he would say, no, there's something special about them, but they didn't get there in the absence of practice.
Yeah. Going back to our story, I wonder if he was kind of being like, it's his message, maybe not perfectly accurate, is very valuable, that you can achieve a lot if you put a lot of effort in practice, the right kind of practice into, is very valuable kind of thing, even though it's not, maybe not, you pushed it a little further than it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because if I'm working with a coach or an athlete, I would probably say exactly the same message, but it would just be framed in a different way. The number one thing you can do to improve is do high quality, deliberate practice. That doesn't mean that your talent isn't important.
Yeah.
Just, in terms of useful instruction and feedback, I don't know of a single thing that would be better, to be honest.
No. Yeah, you can't really change the other thing. The other part, you dealt the cards you're dealt, and no, I think I think it's a really, you're right. I think you did a great job, Joe, of balancing this. There's so many it's the complex interaction at multiple levels, right? And trying to, we need to embrace that, but we still need to do something about it, though. Yeah, we can't just say back, oh, it's too hard, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully systems and coaches maybe have a bit more flexibility or feel a bit more capable of challenging some of the established approaches that we've used, because I think dogmatic approaches to the way things have always been done, that's part of the problem. It assumes that we've got the solution and we figured it out, where the evidence is saying something completely different.
Yeah. And I think there's some good practical ways. And although, it's not the way, it's a way that could kind of benefit everybody and still support all these goals, like we were saying. So it's the Tyranny of Talent. It's on Amazon mostly right now, Joe?
Yeah, Amazon. I'm just finishing up the audio version, so that'll be up on Audible pretty soon. Cool. And it's been a really fun process. So I'm hoping to write some other ones.
I was going to just ask. I think I had the same. Part of the way through, you're like, well, I'm never doing this again. But you get kind of but no, I think it's really valuable. I think like we started this hard, kind of coming with these kind of. You're right, and I really like the way you said it. We can't write. There's no such thing as a timeless. You can tell it's like I could feel your journey. This is where you are right now, right? And then you're not saying it's the end of the path. It's just right now. This is my thinking about this. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think hopefully, and I have you to thank for this. I think because the Learning to Move was such a important book, and the way that you put it out, and the way that you sort of circumvented the traditional system. I would love to see more scientists doing that, because there's barriers that prevent scientists from actually accessing mainstream publishing, and we need to try to get more scientists doing exactly what we've done, because their voices need to be out there and part of the conversation. And so anybody interested in doing something similar, reach out, because I think I used you as a resource, and there's steps to figure out to do it. But once you figured it out, to help someone else do it, I think that would be really rich for our field to get more people doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I felt the same kind of the peer review process. Not that we're saying things that I don't feel like I said anything that's not supported. I don't think you did either, but we're just allowed to have a bit more freedom in our thoughts about it, and you don't have to, every sentence doesn't have to have a reference, right? To some, so I agree. I think it's a really good, and I think, myself and you have so much, this viewpoint you get from, especially if you work on both sides, applied and research side. I think it's good for people to hear it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really, like I said, I really enjoyed it, Joe. I knew a lot of the material, but I think you did a great in weaving in the kind of history of it, there's a lot of fascinating history to talent, somewhat awful, as you mentioned. Yeah. But I think it's really important to connect it all. So I appreciated that as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. That means a lot.
Yeah. So thanks for joining me with this, Joe.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the conversation, Rob.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coach meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.